Augusta Fenwick did not cry out. She did not reach for the door. She did not ask Mrs. Pruitt to explain herself twice, because the first time had been explanation enough. She stood in the doorway of the guest wing in her wedding blue, watching the housekeeper lift the ring of household keys from its hook by the breakfast room and set it, gently, apologetically, into the waiting hand of Mrs. Seraphina Blackwood. Her fingers found the small iron key at her wrist instead, the one she had worn on a ribbon since she was 14 years old, and closed around it until the teeth of it bit her palm. By Sunday she would be gone from that wing entirely. Not to another room, not down the corridor to some marginally warmer chamber with a better view of the lake, out the front door, on the arm of guests who did not belong to that house at all, thanking her host for his hospitality in a voice so level it would be repeated in 3 counties by autumn. But that was 5 days away yet, and the woman standing in the doorway did not know it. She only knew that she had been married 11 days, and that this was the second house she had lived in as a wife, and that in neither of them had anyone handed her a key. The spring of 1819 had come to Merrishire the way it always came, wet and grudging, turning the low fields along the Ash into standing sheets of brown water that would not properly drain until June. It was the flooding, more than anything, that had brought Augusta Fenwick to Rowanmere at all. Her father, Edmund Fenwick, had spent 30 years walking those fields with a levelling rod and a notebook, cutting channels that turned drowned pasture into hay, and when he died the January before, he left behind no title and very little money. But he left behind ledgers that the new Duke of Rowanmere needed rather badly. Julian Harcourt had inherited a dukedom the way a man inherits a debt he did not incur and cannot refuse. The estate's water meadows had failed 3 years running. The tenant rolls were thinning. His late father's steward had kept books that told comfortable lies, and by the time Julian understood how comfortable they had been, half the low farms were unworkable, and the bank in Alderby had begun asking careful questions about renewal terms. Edmund Fenwick's daughter, it turned out, had learned her father's arithmetic at his elbow, the way other girls learned embroidery. She could read a drainage survey the way other women read a menu. When the marriage was proposed to her, quietly, through solicitors, with a settlement generous enough to embarrass everyone who discussed it, she understood precisely what she was being asked to be. Not a wife exactly. A repair. She had said yes anyway, because her father's cottage and the small parcel of land around it, Fenwick's Reach, needed money to keep, and because she had told herself, in the private ledger she kept of her own hopes, that competence shown plainly enough eventually earned its own affection. She had believed that the way one believes an arithmetic proof, quietly, and without drama, right up until the carriage turned in at Rowanmere's gates, and she saw how many other carriages were already there. The house party had been arranged for a fortnight before the wedding was even settled, and no one had troubled to cancel it. Guests filled the good bedrooms. Mrs. Seraphina Blackwood, a rich young widow with a laugh like poured cream, and a mother who had once nearly married a duke herself, had been asked to stand as hostess in the new Duchess's stead until, as the Dowager put it, the household settles. The household did not settle. Augusta was shown to the guest wing on her wedding night, with her trunk still corded, and told by a housekeeper who would not quite meet her eyes that her own rooms were being aired. They were aired for 11 days. On the 4th of those days, coming down early for the ledgers she had asked to see, and been told, twice, that the steward was too occupied to fetch. Augusta heard her husband's mother say, through a half-open door, in the particular voice of a woman who believes herself alone with someone who agrees with her, she will do, I grant you. Necessary even, with the meadows the way they are. But necessary is not the same as wanted, and I would not have you confuse the two, Julian. There was a silence that told her everything the answer would have. She did not weep in the corridor. She counted instead a habit her father had taught her without meaning to, doing sums by lamplight while her mother's grave was still new, and gave herself exactly 10 minutes at the window seat above the stairs to feel the whole of it. 10 minutes, no more, because grief that ran past its ration stopped being grief and became a kind of drowning, and she had watched enough fields go under to know what that looked like. When the 10 minutes ended, she took out the small notebook she carried everywhere, the twin of every notebook her father had ever owned, and she wrote at the top of a clean page, "What is mine?" Underneath it, the cottage, the land around it. £300 settled separately in my name, my father's ledgers, wherever they have been put, my own hands. It was not a long list. It was, she thought, enough to build on. "You'll want Mrs. Pruitt for the truth of this house," said a voice behind her, low and unhurried. It belonged to Abel Rourke, the land steward, a broad grey man who had known her father across 2 counties of drainage disputes and had not yet decided what he thought of the daughter. "She don't love the arrangement any better than you do, ma'am. She just hasn't the standing to say so." "And you have." "I've the standing of a man old enough not to care what it costs him," Rourke said. "Your father drained the Longmead in '02 when 3 engineers before him said it couldn't be done. I watched him do it with a spirit level and a stubborn streak. I expect you've got the streak, at least." It was not comfort exactly. It was the first true thing anyone at Rowanmere had said to her, and she held on to it the way she held on to the key at her wrist. The house party was to conclude that Sunday with a farewell breakfast and a procession of carriages down the long avenue of limes. Augusta rose before the rest of the house, packed her own trunk without ringing for a maid, and came down to breakfast in her travelling clothes rather than her morning gown. The Dowager Duchess noticed first over the chocolate pot and said, with the particular brightness of a woman testing ice before she steps on it, "Are you expecting somewhere to be, Augusta?" "I am expecting to leave," Augusta said, "with the other guests. Sunday is the day for it, I understand." Julian's cup did not quite reach his mouth. "You are not a guest in this house. Forgive me," Augusta said, and she said it so gently that 3 people at the table put down their forks. "I had understood I was. I have slept in the guest wing. I have been given no keys. I have been asked to no household councils. I have dined at the foot of the table while Mrs. Blackwood poured the tea. A guest is a person given every courtesy and no authority, your grace, and I have had every courtesy. I am merely observing the arrangement as it stands and behaving accordingly." The room had gone very quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when it recognises it is watching something it will describe for years. She rose. She thanked the Dowager for her hospitality, using precisely that word, hospitality, and let it sit in the air like a struck bell. She thanked Mrs. Blackwood for keeping the house so well in her absence, and last, before the assembled guests who had come for a wedding and were leaving having witnessed something else entirely, she turned to her husband and said, "Thank you for having me, my lord. It was a very instructive fortnight." Then she walked out among the departing carriages, climbed into the gig old Rourke had, without being asked, brought round to the side door, and left Rowanmere the way a guest leaves a house she does not intend to return to uninvited. Julian Harcourt stood on his own front steps in the thin morning light and did not go after her. He would spend the better part of a year understanding why that had been the wrong choice, and what it had cost him to make it. Fenwick's Reach had stood empty since January, and it smelled of it: cold hearths, damp plaster, a garden gone to seed. Augusta walked through it that first evening with a single candle and found, in her father's old office off the kitchen, the trunk of ledgers she had asked after 11 days running and never received. Someone at Rowanmere had sent them ahead without comment, which told her something about at least one person in that household she had not yet met. She lit a fire in the office grate that night, and did not sleep. She read her father's survey of the Reach's own boggy south field, done the year before he died, half finished, the ink trailing off mid-sentence the way his ink always trailed off when his hands began to shake. She finished the sentence herself, in her own hand, and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time in 11 days. The particular stillness of a woman doing arithmetic she has chosen, rather than arithmetic done to her, was a different thing entirely from the stillness of a woman enduring. She did not weep that night either. She made a list of what the south field needed: 40 rods of tile drain, 2 men for 3 weeks, £11 she did not, strictly, have to spare, and in the morning she walked to Rourke's cottage and asked him plainly whether he thought 2 men could be found for £11 and a promise. "Depends who's asking," Rourke said. "If it's the Duke's wife asking as a Duchess, no. Duchesses don't dig ditches with tenant men for £11. If it's Ned Fenwick's girl asking as Ned Fenwick's girl—" He looked at her a long moment. "Then I expect we can find you 2 men and a boy besides, and we'll take the promise." They found the boy too. His name was Tam Dawlish, 14 years old, whose family farmed 30 acres at the low end of the Reach's boundary, and had lost half a hay crop the autumn before to standing water. Tam worked the way boys work when they are being trusted with something for the first time, which is to say relentlessly, and by the second week he had begun calling the drainage line her ladyship's ditch, with unmistakable pride, as though he had invented the phrase to protect it from being anyone else's. Word of the south field travelled the way water travels downhill, without needing to be pushed. By the 3rd week, a neighbouring tenant with a similar bog on his own ground came to ask, hat in hand, whether Fenwick's girl might look at his land too, seeing, as the Duke's own steward had said, of the meadows, that nothing could be done till autumn at the earliest. She looked. She always looked. And each time she looked, she wrote the numbers down plainly, and let the numbers do the persuading, because her father had taught her that men would argue with a woman's confidence, but rarely with her sums. It was 6 weeks before Julian Harcourt rode out to Fenwick's Reach himself, and he came. He told himself, purely on estate business, a query about a boundary hedge, nothing that could not have waited for a letter. He found his wife standing calf-deep in a ditch in a borrowed pair of boots, directing 2 labourers and a boy with the flat, unhurried authority of a woman who had done this 100 times before, and he sat his horse at the field's edge for a full quarter of an hour before she noticed him, because he did not, in that quarter of an hour, know what he had come to say. "Your Grace," she said finally, climbing out onto dry ground and wiping her hands on her apron with no apparent embarrassment at being found this way. "The hedge in question is 11 inches onto Mr. Dawlish's boundary, not mine. I looked into it last week. I can show you the survey if you doubt it." "I don't doubt it," Julian said. And then, because it surprised him as much as it surprised her, "I didn't come about the hedge." "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine you did." He did not dismount. He sat there a moment longer, watching the ditch line run straight and true across ground that had been standing water in March, and something in his face did a small, private arithmetic of its own, the kind a man does when he is adding a column he has avoided adding for some time. "The meadows at Rowanmere are worse than this," he said at last. 300 acres of them. "My own steward tells me nothing can be done before autumn." "Your own steward is wrong," Augusta said, "and has been wrong for 3 years, which is presumably why you married a Fenwick in the first place." She said it without heat. It landed harder for that. He turned his horse toward home without answering, and she watched him go, and did not let herself read anything into the visit beyond what it plainly was. But that evening, writing in her notebook by the office fire, she added a single new line beneath the old list of what was hers. He came. He did not say why, nothing in it yet. Note it anyway. She had learned from her father that nothing in isolation meant anything at all. It was accumulation that told the truth. She meant to keep counting. The letter that came a fortnight later was not from Julian. It was from a solicitor's clerk in Alderby, a careful young man named Silas Petty, and it asked, with excessive formality, whether Mrs. Fenwick, the address itself a small blade, deliberately or not, retained any of her late father's original survey papers for the Rowanmere water meadows, dated some 11 years prior, as a query had arisen regarding certain figures. Augusta read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then walked out to the ditch line where Rourke was setting the last length of tile, and told him, without preamble, "Someone at Rowanmere is building a case against my father's work." Rourke straightened slowly, the way a man straightens who has heard this kind of trouble before, and does not care for the shape of it. "Then you'd best find your father's numbers before someone else finds them first," he said, "and decides for you what they say." She had by then learned the shape of her own attention well enough to know that this was not a season for weeping over it. It was a season for finding the original papers, before anyone else did, and she went home that evening and began, methodically, to search. The 2 competence trials had cost her 6 weeks and a good deal of skin off her hands, and they had bought her something she had not entirely expected, a name in the county that was not the Duke's discarded wife, but Fenwick's girl, who fixed the Dawlish bog. It was not love. She had not asked it to be love. But she noted, in the ledger she kept of her own hopes, that reputation compounded the way interest compounded, slowly and then all at once, and that she had 6 weeks of principal already banked. What she did not yet know, because he had never told anyone, not even his mother, not in any words that could be repeated, was that Julian Harcourt's father had drowned in those same water meadows 11 years before, riding home in the dark across a ford he had crossed 1,000 times, on a night when Edmund Fenwick's warnings about the rising ash had gone, through nobody's particular fault and everybody's shared cowardice, unread on a steward's desk. Julian had been 16. He had been the one to find the horse first, riderless, at the stable gate at dawn. He had built, in the 11 years since, a doctrine out of that morning, the way a man builds a wall out of whatever stone is nearest, that attachment made you careless, that love was a kind of inattention that drowned people, that the only safe way to hold an estate or a family was to want nothing from it, beyond what it could be relied upon to provide. He had married Augusta Fenwick because Rowanmere needed a Fenwick's competence the way a wound needs a bandage, and he had told himself, with the particular firmness of a man reciting a doctrine he needs to be true, that wanting more than that from her would only end the way wanting things always ended. He had never said any of this to her. He had only said, once in the second week of their marriage, when she had asked him plainly why she had been given no place in his house. "I did not marry you to love you. Rowanmere needed a Fenwick, and you were the only one left." It was, she thought later, the single most honest thing he had said to her, and also the cruelest, and she filed it in the drawer of her mind she kept for facts too heavy to carry daily, and did not take it out again until she had use for it. The Dowager Duchess, meanwhile, had her own arithmetic under way. Cordelia Harcourt had spent 30 years believing that a great house survived on the strength of its alliances and the discretion of its women, and she regarded her son's marriage as a temporary repair, useful for exactly as long as the meadows required fixing, and not one season longer. She had already begun, quietly, through the same clerk who had written to Augusta, to gather whatever might be found regarding the original Fenwick survey, because a survey that could be shown to be flawed, or worse, falsified for fees, would unravel not merely a dead man's reputation, but the settlement itself. And a settlement unravelled could be renegotiated, and renegotiated marriages could, with sufficient patience, be quietly set aside. Seraphina Blackwood had agreed to play hostess at Rowanmere, because the Dowager had been generous with introductions to families Seraphina's own modest widowhood could not otherwise reach, and because she had told herself, in the comfortable way people tell themselves things, that she was merely helping a friend manage an awkward season. She had not yet asked herself what would be required of her if the season stopped being awkward and started being deliberate. It was Silas Petty, in the end, who could not sleep with what he had been asked to copy. Julian came to Fenwick's Reach again in September, and this time he did not sit his horse at the field's edge and turn away. He came to the door and asked to be let in, and Augusta, drying her hands on her apron, let him in. "Mrs. Blackwood has left Rowanmere," he said, without preamble, standing in the small office among her father's ledgers, as though he did not quite know what to do with his hands. "I told her the arrangement no longer served any purpose I recognised as honest. My mother is displeased." "Your mother has been displeased with me since before we married," Augusta said. "I've stopped counting it as news. I am not here about my mother." He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man choosing his words rather than deploying them. "I have watched you drain 3 fields this summer that my own steward called impossible. I have watched a boy of 14 call you her ladyship without irony. I have watched the county begin to speak of my wife in a voice I have not earned the right to feel proud of, and yet I find that I do." "That is not an apology," Augusta said. "No," he agreed, "it is not." "Then what is it?" "I don't know yet," he said, and it cost him visibly to say it. "I know what I told you that first fortnight. I know it was true when I said it. I am asking whether it is permitted to no longer be true." She set down the ledger she was holding, very deliberately, the way she set down anything she meant to give her full attention. "Show me," she said. "Not tonight. Not with words tonight, or any night soon after. Show me over time the way you'd prove a drainage line holds, not in the first rain, but in the 3rd, and the 10th, when no one is watching to see if it fails." He nodded slowly, as though she had handed him a survey he intended to walk in person before he trusted it. Before he left that evening, she took the small key from the ribbon at her wrist, not the household ring, which she had never been given, and did not want given as a peace offering, but her own key, her father's key, to the office where every true number at Fenwick's Reach was kept, and she pressed it briefly into his palm. "You may read anything in that room," she said. I keep no false ledgers. I should like, eventually, for that to be something you can say of me without needing to check." He closed his hand around the key the way she had once closed her own hand around it in a doorway at Rowanmere, and something in the exchange felt, to both of them, like the first honest transaction of their marriage. Silas Petty arrived at Fenwick's Reach 3 days later, unannounced, hat in his hands the entire visit, and confessed before he had properly sat down that he had been asked, some months prior, to prepare a copy of Edmund Fenwick's original survey with certain figures altered, a fee inflated here, a measurement softened there, sufficient to suggest, to anyone who did not look closely, that the elder Fenwick had padded his accounts at the estate's expense 11 years before. "I made the copy," he said. "I could not make myself deliver only the copy. I kept the true one. I have brought it to you because I have not slept a full night since I copied the false one, and I find I would rather lose my position than keep sleeping this way." Augusta laid the 2 documents side by side on her father's own desk and studied them for a long while in silence. "You did wrong to alter it," she said finally. "You did right to bring me this. Both things are true, Mr. Petty, and I do not think you need me to tell you which one weighs more, since you have clearly weighed it yourself already, at some cost. What will you do with it?" "Exactly what my father would have done," she said. "I will let the true numbers speak, in front of everyone who was told the false ones." The reserve counterpunch came a week after that, in the form of a sworn statement, procured, though it took time to trace, through the Dowager's own solicitor, alleging that the marriage settlement itself had been secured under false representation of the Fenwick estate's value, and suggesting, in the careful language such documents favour, that grounds might exist to revisit its terms before the county's quarter-day audit, where such matters were traditionally aired before the assembled tenantry and gentry alike. Augusta read it once, standing in her kitchen with flour still on her hands from the bread she had been making, and did not let the reading disturb her rhythm. She finished kneading the dough, set it to rise, and only then sat down to write, in her clearest hand, a short letter to the county's magistrate, Josiah Cole, a precise and incorruptible man, who had once ruled against her own father in a boundary dispute, and been thanked for it, requesting that the matter of the Rowanmere survey be addressed openly at the coming audit, with all relevant parties invited to speak. "They mean to ambush you," Rourke said when she told him. "Airing it in public plays to their advantage as much as yours. It plays to whoever brought the true documents," Augusta said. "I intend that to be me." The quarter-day audit at Rowanmere had, for as long as anyone could remember, been held in the long tithe barn at the edge of the home farm, where tenants came to settle accounts, and any dispute too large for a private word was set before the county to judge. It was, that October, more crowded than it had been in a decade, because word had travelled the way water travels downhill, that the Duke's own wife meant to answer a charge against her dead father before the whole assembled parish, and no one in Merishire intended to miss it. Augusta wore no mourning for the occasion, and no bridal blue either. She wore plain grey wool, her father's small key at her wrist, and carried, in a leather case she had made herself the week before, every document that mattered. Josiah Cole opened the proceeding with the flat, procedural courtesy of a man who had presided over 100 boundary disputes and found no reason to treat this one differently. The Dowager's solicitor read the sworn statement aloud in full, the allegation that Edmund Fenwick had inflated his survey fees 11 years prior, misrepresenting the estate he later, through his daughter, married into. "I should like to answer that," Augusta said, when he had finished, "with my father's own numbers, and with Mr. Silas Petty's testimony, and with whatever the tenants whose fields he actually drained wished to say about whether the work was done. She laid the true survey beside the altered copy on the long table where the audit books were kept, and invited Cole, and anyone else who cared to compare the two columns of figures line by line. The discrepancies, once set side by side, were not subtle. They were the kind of discrepancy a child could find, given 10 minutes and a willingness to look. Silas Petty stood and said, in a voice that shook only slightly, that he had prepared the false copy at the instruction of the Dowager Duchess's own solicitor, and that he had kept the true one because his conscience would not permit otherwise. Then, before anyone had asked her to, Tam Dawlish's father rose from among the tenant benches, turning his hat in his hands the way Rourke always said honest men turned their hats, and said that he had farmed the low meadow at Rowanmere his whole life, and his father's whole life before him, and that whatever the papers said or did not say, he could tell the assembly with his own eyes that the ground Edmund Fenwick had drained in 1808 had grown hay every summer since without fail, and that a false survey did not grow hay. 3 more tenants stood after him, unbidden, each with a smaller version of the same plain fact. It was Seraphina Blackwood, seated near the Dowager, who broke the silence that followed. She stood, pale but steady, and said that she had agreed to stand as hostess at Rowanmere, believing she assisted a friend through an awkward season, and had since learned that she had been used to dress an ambition she wanted no further part of. I did not know the survey was to be altered, she said. I did know the marriage was meant to be undone, if it could be managed quietly. I am ashamed that I let myself not ask which of those things I was truly helping with. The room's attention turned, all at once and audibly, the way a tide turns, a shifting of benches, a low current of whispered names, the particular sound of a county recalibrating a verdict it had rendered too quickly. The Dowager Duchess sat very still through all of it, her hands folded, her face doing the arithmetic of a woman watching her own sealed letter, for the solicitor's instructions bore her seal plainly enough. Cole confirmed it aloud, condemn her before the very tenants whose regard she had spent 30 years cultivating. I could ask that you answer for this before the magistrate in full, Augusta said to her, when the room had quieted enough to hear it, and I believe, on these papers, that you would have a difficult time of it. I do not intend to ask that. Why not? The Dowager said, and for the first time in 11 months, her voice held something other than command. Because my father spent his whole life proving that a thing done rightly speaks for itself, and I find I would rather be known for that than for what I could have done to you instead. You will step back from the household accounts. You will make no further arrangement on this family's behalf without being asked. And you will live with having been wrong in front of every person in this room, which I think, for a woman who has spent her life on their good opinion, may cost you rather more than a magistrate's ruling would have. Something behind the Dowager's composure went out, quietly, like a lamp turned down rather than blown. Julian's explanation came 2 days after the audit, in the small office at Fenwick's Reach, with the door closed and no one else to hear it. My father drowned in the Ash, he said, 11 years ago. On a night your father's warning about the rising water sat unread on a steward's desk. I found the horse first. I built a whole life out of that morning. A belief that wanting people carelessly was how you lost them, and that the only safe love was no love at all, only use, carefully managed. I told myself I married you for the meadows. It was true. It was also a wall I built so I would not have to notice I wanted more than the meadows from you. That is an explanation, Augusta said. It is not yet an apology. I am sorry, he said plainly, without ornament. I am sorry I let you sleep in a guest wing in your own home. I am sorry I let a fortnight pass while you were called necessary within my hearing, and I said nothing to correct it. I am sorry I told you I had not married you to love you, when the truth was that I did not yet trust myself to love anyone, and it was easier to make that your fault than my fear. All right, she said. All right? All right, she said again, is not forgiveness yet. It is an acknowledgement that you have said the true thing rather than the comfortable one. If we are to go on from here, I have terms, and I would rather state them plainly than have you guess at them. She named them one by one, the way she named the line items in any ledger, her authority over the household accounts undisputed and in writing, her name beside his on any settlement concerning Fenwick's Reach, which she would keep in her own right regardless of what else passed between them. No family council convened on her behalf without her presence. And the ledgers, all of them, at Rowanmere and at the Reach both, open to her hand at any hour she chose to look. Agreed, Julian said. Agreed, she said back, and something in the flat, matching weight of the two words felt, to both of them, like the whole of a treaty signed. Seraphina Blackwood came once more to Fenwick's Reach before she left the county for a small property her late husband had left her in Dorset, which she meant, she said, to run herself from now on, rather than lend her name to anyone else's arrangements. I have no right to ask your good opinion, she told Augusta at the door. I only wished to say, before I went, that I am sorry, and that watching you this autumn has taught me more about what a woman can be than 30 years in drawing-rooms ever did. Then go and be it, Augusta said, on your own ground, the way I had to learn to. The months that followed were not dramatic, and Augusta came to understand that this was the proof itself. Julian moved his own study chair beside hers at the ledger table without being asked, and left it there. He learned to pour her tea before she reached for the pot, a small thing, meaningless once and then, repeated daily through a whole wet winter, not meaningless at all. He brought her the estate's water meadow survey before he brought it to his steward, and asked what she saw in it before he told her what he thought. There was one relapse. In February he hired a new under-steward for the home farm without consulting her, out of the old habit of managing Rowanmere as though it were his alone to manage, and she named it to him plainly the same evening. That is the old pattern, the one where decisions are made for me rather than with me, and he did not argue the point. He rescinded the appointment the next morning and brought her the candidates himself. I would choose you, he told her that spring, standing in the office doorway with the light coming in low and gold across her father's old desk. I have been choosing you for some months now, in rather small ways, and I find I would like to go on choosing you in larger ones, if you will permit it. That is not the bare thing people usually say, she observed. I did not marry you to love you, he said, quoting himself, and then, watching her face, turned the sentence over entirely. I married you because Rowanmere needed a Fenwick. I did not know then that I would come to need you a great deal more than the Meadows ever did. Not because the estate required it of me, but because you, plainly and specifically, are the thing I would build my whole life around choosing, if you will let me go on doing it. All right, she said, and this time it was not an acknowledgment of a true fact. It was the whole of an answer. 2 years afterward, the tithe barn at Rowanmere held its quarter-day audit as it always had, save that the tenant rolls were fuller than they had been in a generation, and the meadows that had once stood under water every spring grew hay reliably enough that 3 neighbouring estates had sent their own stewards to learn Edmund Fenwick's methods. Taught now in a small apprenticeship Augusta had founded at the Reach, with Tam Dawlish, 17 and steady-handed, as its first graduate, and Silas Petty, restored to honest clerking, keeping its books. The Dowager Duchess lived quietly at the Dower House on the estate's far edge, visited on Sundays, no longer consulted on household matters. Her opinion asked for exactly as often as it was wanted, and no more. Seraphina Blackwood wrote twice a year from Dorset, where her own small estate had, under her sole management, begun to turn a modest and entirely respectable profit. The ring of household keys hung, these days, on an open hook by the kitchen door, where anyone might reach it, and beside it, on the same ribbon it had always worn, hung the small iron key to the office where the true ledgers were kept, no longer hers alone to guard, no longer his to grant or withhold, simply there, available. The two of them joined on a single loop the way the two households finally were. The house at Rowanmere, visitors sometimes remarked, had a different feel to it than they remembered from years before, warmer, somehow, though nothing in the furnishings had changed. It was, Augusta thought privately, the particular sound of a house finally breathing after years of holding something in. She had been called necessary once, in a voice that meant to wound her with it. She had answered not by insisting she was loved instead, but by becoming, plainly and patiently, impossible to overlook, and had discovered, in the end, that the two things were not opposites after all, only stages of the same slow arithmetic. She had not asked to be seen, she had made herself impossible to unsee, and that, she had learned, watching a whole county recalibrate its verdict one true number at a time, was not a thing that could be taken from a woman, not by a guest wing, not by a forged letter, not by anyone at all, because it had never been given to her in the first place. She had built it herself, the way her father built drainage through ground everyone else had called hopeless, not because the world required proof of her, but because she required it of herself, and that, in the end, was the only ledger that had ever needed balancing.